All right. Thank you, everyone, for attending our first event here today. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land that we are meeting today in Australia. I pay respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Any decision around nuclear power and energy policy should include the traditional owners of this land. A little bit about me. I'm a former Australian Greens member and a federal candidate. I still maintain close links with the party and the broader Greens movement, but I have a little bit more flexibility in terms of what I can and can't say at not being a member. So last year, a group of Greens members and supporters were frustrated with being blocked by the party from discussing nuclear policy internally. So they decided to go public in an effort to reach other Greens and to progress the conversation. They've approached me to be the spokesperson for the group. And today I'll be interviewing Atte Harjanne, who's a Greens MP in Finland. Atte has a public position in support of nuclear power, and the Greens party in Finland has adopted a policy of neutrality towards nuclear technology as a broader plan to fight climate change and provide energy security. This is a policy unique among Greens parties globally and for Greens politicians. Today we're going to be discussing how they came to that position, how Atte formed his position, and whether Greens globally should be considering adopting a similar position of neutrality. Atte is speaking in a personal capacity today, and he's not acting in an official capacity on behalf of his party. So we have about an hour with Atte, and we will start with a discussion where I will be putting some questions to him. And if we have some time at the end, we're happy to answer some questions. Just to make you aware, we will be moderating the comments throughout this event. Any abusive comments will be deleted. However, we do encourage respectful discussion. So first of all, I'd just like to say, Atte, welcome. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Yeah.
So can you tell me a bit about yourself and what led you to being part of the Greens in Finland?
Yeah. Thanks and hi. Greetings from Helsinki. So it's a bit of an early morning here still. So I hope I'm not too rusty. But yeah, thank you, Tyrone. And so I'm Atte Harjanne. As Tyrone told, an MP here in Finland, representing the Green Party, and actually I was I've been now 3 or 4 weeks vice chairperson, one of the 3 vice chairpersons of our party. And my background is that, short briefly, that I have a master's in science, and my PhD is kind of on a hold because of work in the parliament. I hope to finish that at some point. But before I got elected into the parliament, 2019, I was working at the Finnish Meteorological Institute, researching societal and economic impacts of climate change and energy policy to some extent as well. And besides being an MP here, I'm also acting as a city council member in Helsinki. I've been involved with the Greens since I think I joined 2012 or 2013 after I graduated, and then for me, environmental issues have always been the core, the kind of priority in politics. And then we had a presidential campaign here. We had our presidential candidate running, Pekka Haavisto, back in 2012. I was impressed by his kind of diplomatic style and the way he's making and still is making politics. So I joined his campaign, and then afterwards I joined the Green Party as well. Where I've been a kind of like an active member mostly, I would say, like up to 2017 when I first ran for the city council in Helsinki, got elected, and ever since been been kind of a more in depth of a politician here. And as I said, like environment matters were the priority for me. Also, kind of liberal view on politics in general, and how would I say, kind of humane perspective to the economy and everything. So that's what took me to Greens, and then perhaps what kept me was the Greens for Science and Technology, which is kind of part of the Green Party here in Finland, and active part among the Green Party, where people who are interested in science-based policy making, technology in general, have this their own community or society called the Greens for Science and Technology in Finland.
Okay.
That's briefly.
No, that's fantastic, and those are very much reasons that I joined the Greens here in Australia. Another big issue was refugee rights. We had it's still ongoing, but especially 10 years ago, there was a lot of refugees coming to Australia and asylum seekers, and just we had a very cruel policy towards them, and those human rights issues and standing up for people who didn't have a voice was big for me. So thanks for sharing that. Also interesting that you're a member of parliament and a councillor. That can't happen in Australia.
Yeah, that's a bit of a weird Finnish system that happens a lot. But
yeah, okay, that's really interesting. Can you tell me a little bit about the history of the Greens in Finland? That's something that's really interesting.
Yeah, well, I would say, the Greens have kind of many sets of origins, but they're closely related to the kind of environmental activist movement that took place in the 80s about protecting a specific lake and swamp area. But it was, I think, was similar to many European countries and worldwide development, where this kind of environmental consciousness took its form first in the form of like civil activities and activists, and then formed into a party in the 80s, which kind of had the ecological mindset and the ecological priorities in place. In Finland, the Greens already had seats in the government already in the 90s. One of the earliest Green ministers here was actually in Finland. I think it was 90. Can't remember exactly the year, 95 or something. And then we kind of established as a party in the latter in the 90s, then been active throughout the 2000s, and now we're the fourth biggest party in the parliament, which we had like 12% of the votes, bit less, 11.6 I think, of the votes in the 2019 elections. So we have 20 seats out of 200 seats in the parliament, and in the big cities like in Helsinki, we're big. Nuclear energy, which we're touching upon today, of course, opposing nuclear energy has been, especially in the early parts, was a major issue with the party, of course. But perhaps something that separates us a bit from some of the Green parties in Europe, at least, is that we've also that there hasn't been a very successful liberal party in Finland. That's not because of not having like liberal values. It's more of the political landscape. So it's us, then there are social democrats, then there are National Coalition Party, which is kind of the moderate right-wing party, and left-wing, and then there are Left Alliance and Center Party and so on. So we've also been home for the more ecologically driven liberals, so to say. So we've been a mixed bag of people, I think, from the start. Also considering whether we're kind of left or right leaning, this is kind of ongoing debate also even today. So we're perhaps a bit more diverse background than some of the Green parties, at least in Europe.
Yeah, it's always fascinating reading about and learning about the history of Green parties around the world. The Green Party here in Australia grew out of the protests in Tasmania to save the Franklin River from hydroelectric generation, and also very strongly from the anti-nuclear movement, particularly against nuclear weapons at first, and then kind of nuclear power got drawn into that as well. Australia has quite a rigid party system, very much similar to the UK, probably more so than the UK. You kind of, if you're in a party, you're very ideologically defined by that party. And we'd have two major parties that it's very hard to break for smaller parties to break into government. But the Greens have been slowly growing since the 90s, and they're in positions of council and state governments, and not actually in part of the government itself, but in the parliaments. So and they were instrumental in the 90s in forming the ban that Australia currently has on nuclear power, along with the Australian Democrats, who were a more centrist party, but with green leanings. So yeah, it's really interesting to hear how your party started. It's very very similar in a lot of ways, but also sounds like a more diverse a group of people. So that's really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. Just like that, sounds the broad picture sounds quite familiar that it
Yeah,
is here.
yeah.
Australia.
The green movement internationally is very similar in a lot of ways. So, and there's a lot of often close cooperation between green parties, which is great. So you've already touched on that. Part of what you enjoy about being in the Greens is the Finnish Greens for Science and Technology group. Can you explain what led to that group being created, and what are some of the goals and objectives for that group?
Yeah, I was not one of the. I wasn't there when it was formed, but I think it's, if I recall correctly. Now I should know, but I would say it's. Wait a minute. Uh, 13 years old or something, but I know a lot of the founders. The idea is kind of twofold, especially in the beginning. It was, I think, also had a major role. The idea of being a forerunner in digitalization and the role of digital technologies in politics, making kind of being the voice that has to be considered as well as a very big mega trend. But the other and the more emphasized part nowadays is the idea of having a promoting science-based policy, and this doesn't mean that we're kind of technocrats, but the idea that of course politics is value driven thing to
Yeah,
do. So it's about values and value based choices, but that these choices have to be made. The decisions should be based on the best available science, and that's been the leading thought of Vita, that the science Greens for Science and Technology, and with that comes an idea of making or promoting the idea of the party of the best argument uh, within the Greens, where the idea is that where we look at some matter, we have a goal. Uh, we want to change the society or world in some way, and then we find the best means to do so by kind of finding openly debating and finding the best arguments, what would be the best means to achieve the goals we want to achieve. So that's been the leading thought, and uh, the group has been growing quite steadily, and I think it's one of the fastest growing kind of green movements within the Greens in Finland. We have people who are like I mean, a lot of Greens in Finland are like associated to us. They may be members of some, for example, the Greens for Science and Technology in Helsinki, but they can also be like members of some other Helsinki-based green community. So it's not like exclusive in that sense. So there are like different levels of association for people, but we have a, a, a quite high presence in the party nowadays, and I think the whole party nowadays is largely considered considering and promoting the idea of science-based policy making.
Yeah, that's excellent. And I I personally think that the best way to approach public policy is by looking at the evidence, and finding the best solutions. And it's not always easy when you're confronted with uh, evidence that goes against your personal values or your personal beliefs, and that's something that the Australian Greens really struggle with. We pride ourselves on being a party of evidence, and we often are critical of other political organisations for not being evidence driven. But I think we need to also take time to look at ourselves and our own policies and things like that, and make sure that we're finding the best solutions, and ensuring that we're open to all different avenues of investigation, rather than just, this is what we've always done, or this is our ideological position on this. So that's really interesting, and I'd love for the Australian Greens to adopt a similar kind of group within the party. So you personally have a position on nuclear power, in support of it. I've seen a number of articles where you've given interviews and things on on nuclear power. Was that something that came about from being part of that group, or did you were you kind of open to that before coming into the Greens, or can you give us a little bit of a background about how you came to that position?
Yeah. Just a short comment on your talk. First, that I personally think that the ability to change one's mind in the face of new evidence should be like a very appreciated thing among politicians. Of course, it's hard and difficult, but we should embrace a political culture where that's okay. Um, yeah, I think I was kind of nuclear power has never been like a specifically. Uh, I haven't had like a specifically strong mind about it before joining the Greens, so I haven't kind of turned my coat all over on the subject matter, but it's been a like generic topic. But then when I think the strong opinion when I started to realize that we really need this comes with the work I did as a researcher. The more I kind of studied the kind of scenarios for future energy or energy futures globally, nationally, and so on. I think the math is pretty clear on how much clean electricity and clean heat we need to decarbonize the society. So then I the more I looked into it, then the more convinced I was that actually we should not exclude nuclear power. We should not dogmatically oppose nuclear power. But before that, I was kind of like I was maybe a bit open towards it, quite neutral about it. But being involved with the Greens for Science and Technology, I think somehow I would say maybe helped me to maintain that position, so that there was within the Greens there was this idea of that we should always look at the evidence based way, or look at the science, and be open about it, open about the best means. So within that kind of community, it was always kind of perhaps easier to debate issue and find a look into and be open about it. So it's I don't know. I mean, what I'm trying to say is that I never felt that that the party would have put this, that now if you join us, this is the way it's going to be, this is the opinion that you should have. So there was kind of base for open debate, and that was important for me.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I mean, it's much easier to feel comfortable to research and investigate, uh, different ideas and evidence when you have the space to do that. And it sounds like you had a good network of people there within the party that were willing to discuss that with you, which is fantastic. Um, Personally, when I joined the Greens, I didn't know a lot about nuclear energy. And I very much went with the Greenpeace position of, they do a very good job of providing high quality of videos and things on YouTube, and they present a very convincing argument. If for those who don't know a lot about the subject matter. So, and then the Greens just reinforce that idea of, well, we're Greens, we're anti-nuclear, so this is how it is. But as I found more Greens within the party that were saying, hey, well, maybe there are things there that we need to investigate. I just looked further and started realizing, hang on a minute, this is a lot different to what I thought it was, and things like that. And also realizing the challenge that climate change posed, and just the enormity of the task. So I really wanted to investigate nuclear further, and the more I looked, the more I came to realize that we shouldn't be leaving it off the table in our fight against climate change. So that was really my path towards it. So, uh, so the next question I have is, in the early 2000s, uh, the Greens were in a coalition, I believe, with in government, and a number of Greens MPs resigned over a proposal for um, new nuclear power plants, and that wasn't a long time ago.
Yeah.
And yet here we are in 2021, and the party has a more open mind towards nuclear, and at least a neutrality towards it in terms of trying to achieve emissions reductions and energy security. What kind of changed over that last 20 years that led to that? Was it really just individual conversations within the party? Was it key MPs changing their minds? Can you walk us through how that kind of happened?
Yeah, yeah. First, I'll start with where we are now. So we have two kind of important policy programs for the party. One is the so-called like political goals program. That was we're gonna do a new one next summer, but the one we have now was decided upon 2018. And then we have the party principal program, the kind of higher hierarchy uh, main program that was decided upon last year. And the political goals program from 2018 states something like we're open towards the development of all low carbon technologies, but we're critical of the large scale nuclear power plant projects we've had here. We have two ongoing in Finland. One is supposed to be finalized in next spring, and the other is still, well, basically hasn't even really started constructing yet. And then this new principal program from last year states that we want to see all sustainable technologies used to reduce the amount of the fossil fuels, the use of fossil fuels. So it's pretty much neutral. Of course, some people within the party consider nuclear sustainable, some don't, and so there's a lively debate still ongoing. What has changed? I think there are many things working here, or maybe I would bring out kind of three. First is the kind of the sense of urgency with climate change. So I think that has kind of been emphasized all the time. Or, I mean, we knew about climate change already decades ago, but the sense of urgency with it, and seeing how hard it is to actually cut the global emissions effectively, has kind of made us be less picky about what works. Um, Also, the rise of the sense of urgency with the loss of biodiversity in parallel to climate change, which then connects to another issue, which is that what is the option for nuclear power? And one of the things that's often used, especially in heating here in North, is bioenergy. And I think here our awareness of the the kind of environmental impacts of bioenergy use and the limitations of sustainable biomass, uh, the awareness on those has already also been growing. So kind of I think that our picture of the boundaries, where our kind of energy economy should fit in, has been getting more accurate, I would say. Um, then it's a generational thing also. Of course, people have changed since there are a lot of people still around who were in the early 2000s, but then again, that I think that the younger people are not, they're not tied to, or that they don't have the kind of the memories or are tied to the Cold War era, where nuclear weapons were considered were very closely uh, associated with nuclear power. Uh, so the and also the kind of the the kind of bad things related to nuclear, the accidents. Um, uh, that you don't have like direct memory of that time, so it's considered maybe more neutrally, and so the younger people perhaps have a different view point of view for the whole issue. So that so it's not such definitive part of it. Um, and so I would say that those so people have changed, but they've also changed a bit their opinions. And then in the now in the latest part during the couple of years, now there's also been the idea of kind of looking into new nuclear technologies, mainly small modular reactors, which then could provide a more economic and inherently a bit perhaps safer ways to utilize nuclear energy. I mean, the big plants are safe as well, to be honest, but in terms of any option, like relatively safe anyway. But yeah, so that has kind of opened up new windows of the role of nuclear power. I think in general, the thing in Finland that the energy policy has always been, I could say, somewhat pragmatic. Um, and then the specific issue on nuclear waste has had a bit of a different institutional history here compared to some other countries, where we actually it was decided already, I think, the 80s by principle that this that we will need to have our own national repository, and it's been a long trail of decisions by various governments, and then in the early 2000s, uh, kind of it was decided that we will build a geological final repository near one of the nuclear power plants. And an interesting part here is that the Greens also were in favor of this. So there was this idea that actually, whether we like nuclear power or not, uh, we should be managing it responsibly, and we should take care of the waste we produce. And I think that has that kind of solved. I mean, the repository is supposed to be start. It's supposed to start running in around 5 years, but the we kind of that we were part of decision making, kind of constructive decision making regarding nuclear power. Uh, in that sense, already, I think that kind of changed the mindset perhaps a bit too. But yeah, a lot of things. But I would point out that at the moment, the biggest is the urgency regarding climate change and the loss of biodiversity that push for it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I find in Australia it's a very much a generational thing as well. In Australia we had the British nuclear tests here in Australia, which were devastating for the traditional owners of the land in South Australia. We and the public wasn't in consultation with the public. We weren't made aware. Um, there was a lot of really kind of shady stuff happening around nuclear weapons. Obviously, there was the global nuclear weapons tests that were going on, and rightly so. There was a lot of concern about that and anger from the public. But we've come a long way since then. We've got international treaties. We've stopped nuclear testing. So a lot of younger Greens see, well, we found political solutions to those problems. The kind of the we need to find political solutions now to climate change, and see that there's technical solutions, including nuclear power. And loss of biodiversity is a big one in Australia as well. We have a terrible record on biodiversity loss. Uh, you know, we are a big country compared to Finland or other European countries, but you know, people are realizing that it's not just empty country. There are species there, and that we need to be looking after them, and that there are impacts from all kinds of energy production. So it's about that finding that balance to uh, provide for ourselves, but also ensure that we're protecting the environment. So, and there's also uh, a lot of Indigenous rights issues here in Australia. We've got a long history of treating traditional owners here very poorly. So Greens really want to ensure that if we do develop any energy policy, that it's in consultation with and made considering traditional owners. And Australia is a nuclear nation. Whilst we don't have nuclear power, we've had research reactors. We produce a lot of medical isotopes and things like that. But we don't really have a national plan to manage that waste even. And unfortunately, it's both a combination of Greens opposing any kind of proposal for managing that waste, and also governments, particularly conservative governments here in Australia, not acting in good faith. So I think we need to work together to try and find solutions for these problems. But they are political, not technical, as we've found. So you briefly touched on it, but Finland has a nuclear industry, unlike Australia. So, what have been some of the benefits of having that industry, and what have been some challenges posed by having nuclear industry?
Yeah. Again, I just recalled one thing I was supposed to say in the previous question, regarding the previous question, is that actually, if you look at the early 2000s, then there was of course a debate of how to get investment in variable renewables ongoing here in Finland, like wind power, and Greens were promoting that stuff, and then pretty much everyone else was against it, and so the kind of the situation back then was like, whether you like new nuclear or new wind, which is not the right question. It's be looking at
Yeah,
how to scale up all low carbon options. So the kind of the the paradigm in that sense, I think, has shifted and is shifting. Yeah. Finland has four running nuclear power plants. They were all built in 70s and 80s, and then, as I said, the major, really big EPR reactor is supposed to start running in the next spring. The benefit of that is that we get a lot of clean electricity out of it. So that's of course the main thing, and And for example, now in Europe, we're facing really high energy prices due to kind of bouncing back from COVID and due to especially Germany phasing out nuclear power is kind of shifting the energy economy in Europe, and us having the quite a lot of nuclear power helps us. It diversifies our energy portfolio and makes us less dependent on imported gas, for example, and coal. Uh, and I also think that it hasn't been really an export industry for us. So two of the reactors are of the old reactors are kind of Western technology from Sweden, and two are from Eastern Bloc from Soviet Union. They've been updated with Finnish technology and ever since. So they're running, but I think it gives us an advantage in the future where I think more and more people, nations, political parties are understanding the idea at the point that we really need all the low carbon energy we can have. So having that industry kind of kept alive and running is an important thing when we need to start scaling it up. And also regarding I would say that we're the leading nation regarding the geological repository technology. It's a political issue, as you said. So it has to be that's the bottleneck in basically all the other countries. But at least we can prove that we can have a working solution for that, and I think that's something that we can also give. It's going to be a kind of like an export technology in the future, I guess, and to some extent it is already now. But yeah, I think that the main issue is that as we've had the reactors all the time and they've been updated, upgraded every now and then during their life cycle, that means that we still have people who know how to run nuclear power plants, which is a good thing when we're going to need, I think, more of them in any way. So we have some speciality, and also our radiation safety authority, I think, is highly appreciated in Finland, but also abroad as an expert institution regarding nuclear safety. This is also one thing I think one reason behind high acceptance of nuclear power in Finland is that in I think it was already in the 60s was this how the institutional framework regarding nuclear energy was formed, that actually the energy part of that stuff is under the ministry responsible for energy, but the safety authority is actually under responsibility of social and health care ministry, which kind of gives it a bit of an independence. So there's a high kind of public trust towards these institutions that are uh, responsible for nuclear energy, and I think that has taken off the kind of the shadiness of the industry here, and which I think has been a problem in many other countries, which then has backfired in terms of the acceptance and the legitimacy of nuclear power.
Yes, that's a very good point. Speaking to Greens and even some Labor, who's kind of centre left party here in Australia, they very much say, well, we've had issues with stability of our government over the last decade. We've been through a number of different prime ministers. There's been a number of instances of corruption and things like that, and they say, well, I'm in favour of nuclear power, but I have concerns that the government isn't going to manage it correctly. And so you make a very good point around the importance of good frameworks for managing the industry, and the fact that international frameworks play an important role in regulating different countries' nuclear programs. There are 32 countries in the world with nuclear power. And so I often say to people, well, I don't think the international community would allow us to have a dodgy nuclear industry, because it would blow back on them. It would hurt Finland. It would hurt any other country operating nuclear power, because we live in a globalized society where people go, well, there was this accident in Japan, we're not going to have nuclear power in our country now. So I think that's a really important point around the regulatory frameworks for managing nuclear power. And with the next question I had for you was around the Deep Geological Repository, that's very unique for your country. Other countries are exploring it, but you've probably the furthest down that path. Here in Australia, there's been a number of discussions about geological repositories because we are a very geologically stable country. And it's interesting because waste is a big factor for the Greens when you're talking about nuclear power. So I guess, can you walk us through, how that Deep Geological Repository works as a possible solution, and how the country got there? I mean, you touched on it a little bit, but
Yeah, it's a cool place. I visited it. So it's called Onkalo, which is kind of deep cave in Finnish, and it's near the shoreline in the western part of Finland. We also have a very old solid bedrock here, so you could just drill into it. And the idea is to put the waste in this copper caskets, and then they are buried there underground, and then the tunnels are filled with I don't know what's the substance called. It's the same stuff you put on cat litter, actually. That when it gets if water gets in, it kind of gets bigger, so it sucks it up. And the idea is that this has been extensively studied. The same technology was developed together with in Sweden and Finland, but Sweden hasn't managed to do the political decision regarding the use of it. And it had it was as I said, it was a addition that developed. The political decision developed during decades from the early start of the nuclear industry in Finland all the way to the 2010s, when the last decisions were made. And now the idea is to start repository putting the actual waste in there in during this decade. And so there are, of course, everything is kind of, risks are always calculated in a way, but this I've never seen a technology or industry that has been so thoroughly thought, because I don't know if any other industrial process you take waste and it's thought so thoroughly that what's going to happen and how it's going to be in 1,000 years, in 10,000 years, in 100,000 years. Of course, you can never know how the world can develop, so the society develops on timescales like this. But what I think is that the risks, it's important to consider the different risks on these kind of somewhat unimaginable timelines. But then at the same time, what are the options? I mean, if you just emit carbon to the atmosphere, it's going to be there for a long time too. It's going to change the planet. It's a very high, very difficult risk to control. Whereas toxic waste, the volume of the waste is actually quite small compared to the energy produced. I mean, I think and now I'm just taking numbers off my hat, but I would say that the annual amount of nuclear high level nuclear waste in Finland produced is something of a size of a refrigerator or something like that. I mean, that's the scale of it. So compared to any other industrial process, that's it's some, although it's radioactive, it's quite manageable type of waste. So that's I think that should be always considered when it's problematized. It's good. It is a challenge, but then you can always, like, you can never have like truly perfect solution to a situation like that where you can be 100% sure that nothing will happen and so on. But you have to look at the risks in comparison to the risks you're taking if you exclude nuclear power. An interesting detail regarding the deep repository is that it's basically that waste is retrievable for the next 100 years or so. This was actually kind of demand from the Greens in the early 2000s, that we were kind of looking at maybe it could be. I mean,
okay.
reused, but I consider that somewhat unlikely, and then it's going to be kind of sealed up. Um, yeah, so that's an interesting. I think it's an interesting case of where, in terms of climate change, and we're anyways facing in like ethical questions and how we deal with very long term risks and change in the planet we're making. This is a very limited set of similar kind of thinking, and I, for example, I'm confident that it's good enough for sure to use the repository. And but yeah, regarding again here the decision making, it's interesting. I think the legislation around it is interesting because, for example, the municipality where it's located, by law, the municipality has a veto, so the it couldn't be decided just on a national level that it's going to be put there, but
Yes.
the local community had a veto over it, and they voted in favor in the end. So and were compensated. So I think that the legal and institutional framework around this once again was important, that it kind of has a legitimacy and a high social acceptance.
Yeah, I think that's a really important part of finding solutions is the willingness to work together and find compromises and understand that, you know, people will make decisions if they're aware of the information and can make assessments on risk and things like that themselves. Oftentimes it's very top down approach, but we want to include people in that process. It'd be great in Australia if the Greens and the two major parties could, come to some kind of position together around waste management and things like that. And just on, as you were saying about the amount of nuclear waste, looking at the numbers, the 60 years of civilian nuclear production and the amount of waste is less than Australia produces in general waste every year. So, and general waste comes with its own issues of, land use and gases that come off out of the ground and things like that. So, it's really important that we put these into perspective and manage the risk. And I just have a short clip here from Elon Musk talking in Italy about putting those risks into comparison. So I'll just play that shortly.
People should really think positively of nuclear energy. I'm talking about just traditional nuclear energy that's well engineered, and I think these days recently I've been surprised by a movement away from nuclear energy, but I think actually the reality is it is actually quite safe, and we should have more nuclear energy, or at least not shut down the nuclear power plants that we already have. My considered opinion is that they do not present a danger. But there's a strong movement to get rid of nuclear power plants, which I think is not good, especially if they are to be replaced with coal power plants. I think the evidence is very clear that there's much more of a health risk from coal power plants than there is from nuclear.
Yeah, so it's good putting it in, framing it in context there of, there are the risks from air pollution and things like that if we fail to decarbonize and move to cleaner energy sources. So I'm just mindful of time because we've gotten into a really great discussion here. So I might just skip to one of my later questions, and that's around, do you think environmental organizations globally sometimes frame the debate in rather simplistic terms about, if we just put enough solar panels up or enough wind turbines up, we're going to be able to, solve the world's problems around climate change and poverty and things like that. It's a little bit more complex than that, isn't that?
Yeah, definitely is. I think it's the narrative that this is an easy thing, that if you just understand to build enough solar panels or wind turbines, this will be solved. I think it's actually a pretty dangerous narrative, because it kind of gives the idea that there are good technologies and like evil and bad technologies. No, there are technologies with different pros and cons, and they should be evaluated, as you said, like put into perspective. And we still face with the 100% renewable ideas, we still face the fundamental issue of variability of wind and solar, and the low energy density of those forms of energy, which it's not an inherently, it's not a bad thing, but it's a thing.
Yeah.
That means that we need to build a lot of capacity on those. We need to have a lot of either storage technologies, or some baseload technologies are huge overcapacity, and all this takes resources. And regarding the storage technologies, we're still the kind of the system level storages of the timescales that we need. They pretty much exist on paper only, and I haven't seen one convincing like 100% renewable energy modeling that wouldn't make highly optimistic assumptions about how to tackle the variability. And if you agree with the optimistic assumptions, then it's okay, then it works. But typically the problem with these scenarios is that they make highly optimistic assumptions about the storage technologies, also the scalability of wind and solar, which are they're technologies that take resources as well. They need mining, uh, they need rare earth metals and everything, so they are not made out of thin air, and they take space. I mean, wind and solar, that you can use rooftops, you can put them in between the farms and everything. It's there are a lot of good locations, but they also do take land and resources, and these already cause conflicts. For example, here in northern Finland, it's not everyone wants a wind turbine on their landscape, and although I think these are excellent technologies and we should be scaling up them in a much faster pace than we're doing now, they still have their kind of cons and problems as well, and they should be taken into account. If you have this too kind of optimistic idea, or this kind of fairy tale future narrative, then it can make it harder for us to make the actual decisions, and it can cause like disappointment when you start seeing that it doesn't actually work that way. The path isn't that clear. I mean, Europe is full of examples. Germany, Belgium, uh, phasing out nuclear has made kind of cutting emissions and providing reliable energy much harder, and as seems to create a dangerous lock in to natural gas or biomass burning, and those are worrisome developments. So yeah, I do think that that's often a bit too simplistic. Instead of having a like analytical approach on how to tackle a major global uh, challenge, the biggest challenge we're facing right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And we were talking a little bit before we started about how every country has its own unique challenges. Not every country will have the same solar resources or wind resources or hydro resources. A lot of those countries that have been blessed with hydro resources, for instance, have been able to decarbonize very quickly, which is fantastic. And that leads me into the next question, where we've spoken previously about the kind of the push from countries like Germany, where there is a large Greens presence, not necessarily as the government itself, but they have a large presence within the parliament, and within public opinion around trying to force the phase out of nuclear power. Even in Belgium, for instance, I was shocked to find that the Greens energy minister is closing down nuclear power plants in favour of natural gas. That I was like, are you a Green minister, or are you a minister for natural gas? And it's very seems counterintuitive that they would be that the anti-nuclear stance is so much stronger than the stance to try and tackle climate change, and within the EU structure, it's concerning for you. You were saying that you hope that nuclear can remain an option within the EU.
Yeah. So the EU, I mean, the Belgian example is good one or a very bad one, in the sense that it's a kind of horrible way logic where you actually, I think that the risks are not put into perspective, and the anti-nuclear stance is prioritized over tackling climate change, which for me is, I don't know, I can't follow that logic. But at the same, I mean, we're hearing voices, politicians from, say, Austria saying, which is another very anti-nuclear country, saying that that the countries who phase out nuclear should be allowed to be slower to reduce their emissions because they've done this
Yeah,
great
we
decision
actually
to
have a
do.
clip. I'll play a clip
Yeah.
for those watching of the Austria arguing
Ah.
that they should have a lesser target because they aren't using nuclear. So I'll play that now.
I'd also like to discuss the question of atomic energy, nuclear energy, in this forum. I know that most of your countries are investing in this sort of energy. We're not in Austria. We've made a clear statement that we do not want any nuclear energy. That's a principle which is enshrined in our constitution. We should not therefore have a situation where all countries are treated the same, whether they use nuclear energy to get to reduce CO2 or not. We're not in the same position. We shouldn't be treated the same way. Vice President Timmermans, I heard, compared on an equal footing nuclear energy and green energies, treating both as equally valid and equally acceptable. I know that this can be a very controversial topic, and there are some countries around this table who are investing heavily in nuclear in order to reach their environmental goals. I would like to make very clear that we will not be going down that path. We've made a very clear commitment in this regard. In my opinion, quality is more important than being the fastest. We have to continue. We are just beginning these intense discussions. We have to continue with them, involving everyone, all of the stakeholders in the problem. That's what our companies here in Europe deserve. Thank you.
So what you're hearing there is the quality instead of being the fastest. And this is often what we hear when we're talking about nuclear energy, is this, the right way to be green and the wrong way to be green. And I saw an interesting article recently where you were criticized for being green the wrong way. And it just seems like a bizarre situation we're in when, the latest IPCC report came out and, it's a code red for humanity. It just seems so confusing as we head into COP26 in Glasgow next month, we're hoping to see another global agreement around reducing emissions. And when we have countries taking these positions, it just seems very strange.
It doesn't. And in Europe, I would say that the EU has this kind of ongoing debate about so-called taxonomy, where we put criteria on what investments should be considered green or not. And the role of nuclear power has been highly contested in this. It was left out originally, and now we're waiting for the European Commission's kind of statement of whether it's going to be included in the future or not. And that's, I mean, that it was delayed, and the Joint Research Center, the scientific body, was set to assess this issue, and they pretty much came up with the conclusions that if you put that there are no science-based reasons to exclude nuclear, so that the risks to environmental human health are comparable to wind and solar, and yet even this still remains like a politically contested. I think the science is clear, but it's still challenged by politicians, and I think this is a dangerous thing, and I really hope to see. I mean, if a country like Austria has decided that they opt out of nuclear, fine. I guess it's up to them, but at least it should not then be. I mean, then it's a problem that you have to then handle. But realizing that it makes addressing the global challenges much harder, much more difficult, and it's a kind of stance that should be pushed to others, I think. but yeah, in Glasgow, I think we're still heading to Glasgow still in this world where renewable is good and nuclear is dubious, and this has to change. And I do hope that more and more governments, more and more NGOs as well. I know it's hard to change your opinions, but would look into that the competition is not between nuclear and wind and solar. It's between whether we decarbonize, get rid of fossil fuels fast enough or not. And that does require a lot of low carbon energy.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you on that. And so, just finally, before we either let you go or we answer some questions, do you think globally more Greens should be reconsidering their position on nuclear power? I know, as you just said, it can be very difficult to change your position especially when your identity politically and both individually has been tied up in a particular position for a long time. Do you think that we should be reconsidering those positions given the challenges of climate change?
Yeah, definitely, I think, but I mean, but what I especially would like to address is putting ends over means. So that's kind of the paradigm shift. Whatever works, then let's use it, and then having an analytical approach, a science-based approach, uh, not and kind of doing the math and looking at the real life boundaries we're facing, and then be open-minded about the different ways of addressing those problems. So instead of dogmatic opposition, embrace the debate, do the analysis, and prepare for being open to change your mind. Well, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the optimistic assumptions are okay, and we don't need new nuclear. Well, that would be great news. But
Yep.
I don't think it's responsible to, from my point of view, to kind of to trust in that. But yeah, so I would say embrace the debate and analytical approach. In general, whether you end up promoting nuclear or not, it should be based on a good analysis.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for this conversation. Do you need to get going now, or do you have a little bit of extra time?
I think I can have like 10 minutes if we have questions. So
Okay.
okay.
So I'm just having a look at the chat that we have here, and seeing what we've got any questions. If you have some questions, it'd be great. Put them in the chat, and I'll ask Atte while we still have him here. I think we had one question earlier. Let's just have a look what we have here. So one of the questions was the Greens leader here in Australia, when it was announced that we might be having nuclear submarines, he referred to them as floating Chernobyls that would be in every city in Australia. I mean, as Greens, we tend to be against, massive military expenditure and things like that. But what do you think about that kind of commentary? Do you think that's helpful in terms of debates like that, or is it rather inflammatory?
I think this kind of mystifying nuclear power and radioactivity, it's a problem. It creates this dubiousness around nuclear power in general. I mean, you can that there's nothing mysterious in than in any other technology, I guess, in nuclear power. And so I would kind of, I mean, there are probably good reasons to oppose like huge military spending and weapon systems, but I would not use that as a kind of a trick to also oppose nuclear power like civilian uses. I think the idea of saying that some technologies are bad or evil, it's not a very constructive approach. We should be putting things in perspective, as you said, and weighing in the pros and cons. That's and I think like these types of narratives are not very useful in terms of that. I mean, you can even go. I mean, although I've been saying that we need to get rid of fossil fuels, that's for sure. But I don't still consider even them like some being evil. They've created a lot of wealth in this, and the kind of a lot of the stuff we're enjoying, the quality of living has been based on cheap energy. We've used it too much and done really bad things to the atmosphere. But again, all technology should be considered as its pros and cons, and from those look at good policies to kind of minimize environmental impacts and maximize societal benefits. And that should be I think that's the approach I would promote for.
One question we have is what's Finland's plan to do to decommission nuclear power plants? Is it something that you want to like increase the lifespan of nuclear power plants to try and ensure that they can be replaced with other low carbon sources of energy? Is it a concern amongst people in Finland around the costs or the challenges of decommissioning nuclear facilities?
Yeah, the first kind of some of the licenses have to be renewed in the end of this decade already, and at the latest. But we're expecting now one of the power companies to put the first like lifespan extension proposal for some of the plants that were built first, and I mean, of course, the Radiation Safety Authority is going to be saying whether that's okay or not in terms of safety. But if it is technically safe, I would be very disappointed if they don't want to extend the lifespan, because that's pretty much like a really economic source of low carbon electricity. And this we're facing with all the 4 reactors. But whether it happens in the 30s or 40s or when the decommissioning, it's going to happen sometime. And we also had a research reactor here, actually in the campus of my university, and its decommissioning has been underway for some time, and then that's been kind of like a practice round for developing these skill sets and expertise. But regarding the costs, there is actually the nuclear power companies they have to put money in this fund regarding these issues. So so it shouldn't be. I mean, the costs have not been kind of hidden. So they're counted in the future. But yeah, so it hasn't been risen as a political subject matter that much. If we still build new power plants, new like large scale nuclear power plants, the most logical spots for them would be the same areas where the existing infrastructure is already. So perhaps we'll see plants being decommissioned and new ones being built at the same sites at the same time. So but we'll see. But it's in a matter of a couple of years that we'll see what's this time scale of the first decommissioning decommissioning. And but it hasn't been. I think here the institutional framework and the regulation around it seems to be quite good in the sense that it hasn't become a political problem, at least not yet.
Yeah, and this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, where almost due to the nature of the industry, nuclear, is required to look at its whole life cycle from mining all the way to the waste management, and there's not really an industry that's comparable in terms of that kind of management. And this plays into the cost a little bit. People often say, well, new nuclear is more expensive than renewables. But that's because it's a very safe industry. There's a lot of regulation around the waste management and other environmental considerations. Whereas, we're seeing, solar panels just dumped kind of on developing nations, and they're having to deal with the management of that waste, or you've got poor labor standards in producing solar panels in China, for instance. So we've got to look at these full, comprehensive kind of from cradle to grave kind of regulations, and I think the more we apply the same standards that's applied to nuclear to other industries, I think the more we'll see the benefits. So one of the other questions we have here is, what kind of methodology did you have for selling good nuclear to Greens, given how kind of hesitant and skeptical they are?
Well, as I kind of the same message I said earlier, I think it's not about pushing your own conclusion that much. It's about embracing open debate and science-based approach. And again, I do emphasize that it might very well be that I will be proven wrong, and I'm totally fine with that. But what I want to see is the Greens as a movement, as one that bases its kind of policy making in science and kind of does the math. That's what I've been emphasizing, and I think the more you look into it like this, the more people heads start to turn. And okay, that does make sense, and at least we shouldn't fiercely oppose it, or we shouldn't exclude it. And I mean, if you say that it's if you go with the argument that it's costly, that it's too costly compared to solar and wind, well, then is that a reason to oppose legislation that allows nuclear power? No, I don't think so. I mean, if the markets work like that, maybe it's too costly. Although typically the problem here is that we are comparing oranges to apples, and that system level cost is the thing that matter, not the spot prices of electricity. So kind of being open and I think that the kind of burden of proof is on the person who wants to specifically fiercely oppose and exclude a technology from the kind of toolbox we should be having when we're tackling climate crisis. Yeah.
Okay, that sounds really reasonable, and I think it's important that we, are very respectful to each other about, our existing positions, and ensure that we're not, being antagonistic. Oftentimes around this debate, it can be from both sides. It can be, very personal, and people are very entrenched in their views. So it's really important that we come at this in a respectful way, and as you said, a very evidence-based approach.
Definitely.
So I think we might conclude there. This has been an excellent discussion. Thank you so much for joining us today, and all the best with your work and with the Greens in Finland. And perhaps we might have you back in the future.
I sure hope so. Thank you for inviting me, Taro, and it's interesting to change views and excellent points by you. And I also want to stress and underline that be respectful to other people. That I mean, there's no reason to be antagonistic or make fights over matters where we can have a good open debates. But yeah, thanks a lot. I gotta run to. The day is starting here, so the first committee meeting is about to start soon. So I'll start heading to the parliament. But thanks again for inviting me. And if anyone in the audience has any questions or anything to comment, you can also send them to me as well. So feel free to contact in any matters, and have a nice weekend in Australia.
Great. Thank you, you too. And thank you to everyone that has joined us today in this conversation. This has been a good first event, and we look forward to having many more in the future around this topic. So thank you very much. Thanks, Atte.
Thank you.